Open up your Bibles, if you would, to Luke 16. It's the third book of the New Testament. There's an Old Testament and then a New Testament. And you say, what's the difference? Well, the New Testament is from the birth of Jesus on. And so Luke is the third book. There's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and then John is the fourth gospel. So Luke is the third gospel. Here's a little historical fact that you may find interesting. That Matthew, Mark, and John were all Jewish writers that wrote the Gospels. They were eyewitness accounts and that type of thing. Luke was a Gentile. He wasn't Jewish. He was Greek. But he was alive at the time of Jesus. He traveled on Paul's missionary team. And we don't know if he had a personal encounter with Jesus when Jesus was ministering on the earth physically. We do know that he became a Christian, and that he wrote this book after talking with eyewitness accounts, different apostles and things like that. And he was a physician, so he was very detail-oriented, more so than a lot of the Gospels. And so he writes down one of these accounts of what Jesus said. So in Luke 16, verse 10, it says this. It says, if you are faithful in little things, everybody say little things. You'll be faithful in large ones, but if you're dishonest in little things, you won't be honest with greater responsibilities. And if you are untrustworthy about worldly wealth, who will trust you with the true riches of heaven? And if you are not faithful with other people's things, say other people's things. If you're not faithful with other people's things, why should you be trusted with things of your own? So again, this is Jesus saying this, that one of the things that we prove ourselves that we're ready to handle our own stuff, our own things, is how faithful we are with things that aren't ours. Now, to me, this is kind of a sobering thing because it's real easy for me, if I'm not careful, to write off things that aren't mine. Well, it's not mine anyway. It's real easy to do that. I know that maybe some of you, this is your story too. My dad and kind of their generation, I was kind of raised this way. That a lot of times, like, if you loaned my dad your car, then he would give it back to you with a full tank of gas. He always kind of had this mindset that it needs to be as good as, if not better, when I give it back to you than what it was when you gave it to me. It was just this mindset that was kind of a part of their culture at that time. And I'm a little concerned that, that we're kind of so inward focused and me focused and in such a hurry that we've lost a little bit of that in our culture. And yet Jesus said it was so significant that for you and I, it's one of the ways that we prove ourselves and how we handle somebody else's stuff, somebody else's relationships, somebody else's business, somebody else's dreams and resources. That all of those things are ways that we prove ourselves. Are we ready for our own? Tomorrow some of us are going to we're going to work at a job and we don't own the company. And it'd be real easy just to say, well, it's not mine anyway. They should be paying me more, and maybe they should. However, we get to do this and prove ourselves that we're ready for our own thing. You say, and here's one of the things. If we would just do this, if we would treat our work like it's an act of worship, where it's like, Lord, this is yours. What kind of gift would that be to him? Do we do it in such a way, do we work in such a way that he would be honored, that he'd be like, oh man, I could see you really worked hard here. I could see you really invested yourself, that you really operated in integrity. And of course, I'm honored by that act of worship that you gave me, that gift. Or would we have to hold up to him and it'd be like, it's really not very valuable to you, is it? It's just really didn't matter. You just kind of went through the motions. And for us, there's something powerful about getting to prove ourselves. We at first, more often than not, we get to prove ourselves with things that aren't ours. And again, I'm using a job as an example, but it can apply to so many things, man. If you're single and you're dating somebody and you have a hope to get married, there's a possibility the person that you're dating is not going to be your spouse. Are you treating them in such a way that you would want somebody that would treat your spouse right now? They may be your spouse. They may be the person that you're going to get married, but is it being done in an honorable way? Are you treating them in a way that you would want somebody to treat your future wife, your future husband? When, if you don't have kids yet and you're in a position to watch other people's children, are you treating them in a way that you would want your kids someday to be treated? And so with all of these things, we get a chance to prove ourselves, to prove that we can be trusted by how we deal with things, by how we deal with other people's things. And so Jesus said that if we're faithful with other people's stuff, let's read this again. He said, and if you're not faithful with other people's things, why should you be trusted with things of your own? So number one is this. One of the places we prove ourselves is in the way we handle things that aren't ours. So all of us in here have things that are not ours, but we have access to. We've been entrusted with. Are we being faithful with it? And again, could I offer it as an act of worship and say, Lord, this, what I've done here, I'm going to give this to you. Be honored with this. Like I'm doing it for him. So it's one of the ways we prove ourselves. Look at number 2, if you would go with me, if you would, to Exodus 3. Exodus is the second book of the Bible. Genesis and Exodus. Exodus chapter 3. And Exodus is where Moses is called, and he's delivered from the waters. He lives in Pharaoh's palace. He's adopted by him for 40 years. He kills a guy and then has to run and escape for the next 40 years. And so during this season where he's it's kind of his secret years, kind of his hidden years, we see some things that take place. By the way, right now I'm reading a book called Anonymous. If you're a book reader, it's really spoken to me. I would encourage you to read it. One of the statements they made in there, which I thought was really good, is that we don't spend time, we invest it into a future we can't see. And so that's part of being faithful, is investing our time in what we can't see. Well, in Exodus chapter 3, verse 1, it says this. One day Moses was tending the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led the flock far into the wilderness and came to Sinai, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the middle of a bush. Moses stared in amazement. Though the bush was engulfed in flames, it didn't burn up. This is amazing, Moses said to himself. Why isn't that bush burning up? I must go see it. When the Lord saw Moses coming to take a closer look, God called to him from the middle of the bush, Moses, Moses, here I am, Moses replied. Now, right here, what we have is we have Moses that when he was a young man, he served in Pharaoh's palace, and really we believe that probably some point along the way, he believed this stirring in his heart began to come about, saying that, look, you're going to be the guy that delivers the children of Israel out of Egypt. He begins to hear his story and realizes that he was a Hebrew as well. And so he tries to take things into his own hands, and he messes it up like we often can, and he has to run for his life, and he ends up working for his father-in-law and taking care of his father-in-law's flock. So about 40 years after he has to run from the palace, for 40 years he serves his father-in-law, taking care of his father-in-law's stuff, looking after his father-in-law's things, and here he is in Sinai. He's like in the wilderness, and He's kind of anonymous right now. He's on, nobody's really supervising him. He's out on his own. And I think about all the things that he could have done. And yet here he is being faithful, caring for his father-in-law's stuff. And in this moment, not when he's preaching, not when he's doing his own thing, but in this moment of anonymity, in this moment where he feels obscurity, that God begins to speak to him while he's dealing with his father-in-law's things. I'm amazed so many times in our lives when we're doing things that we kind of have to push ourselves to do. That it almost doesn't feel fair how we got here. And we can feel invisible, that in those moments we have to be reminded, we've talked about this before, that God sees us. But here's what I've also noticed, that in those moments, God begins to speak to us. Now the challenge is that often we don't know what day that's going to be on. For years, he'd cared for his father-in-law's flock. For years, he got out of bed, went and took care of somebody else's stuff. It started out with days, and then weeks, and then months, and then years, and then decades. And when he got up that day, it was probably no different than any of the days before. He probably had no idea that this was going to be the day that God was waiting on him in a place, and all that it required is for him to once again be faithful, caring for his father-in-law's stuff. Over and over again, we see this in Scripture. We see David, who's one of my favorite individuals in the Bible. We see him that on the day that he was elevated in the eyes of a nation, he had no idea what was waiting on him. All he knew is that he was taking care of his dad's sheep. Many historians think that he was given that as a form of punishment because his family didn't value him. And his dad said, look, I want you to go to where your brothers are in battle. I want you to take this food to them. I want you to go and see how the battle's doing, and then come back and tell me how it is. And before he left, the very first thing he did was he found somebody to take care of his father's sheep, and then he went off on his journey. A journey that was unsupervised. A journey that he could have lied and said, yeah, I went there. They're doing great. But he was alone by himself and he went there. And little did he know at the time that awaiting him at the end of this journey, at the end of his obedience, was the moment that God had chosen to elevate him in the eyes of a nation. He shows up, and a guy's in the valley that he had no idea who he was, a guy of reputation, a guy of battle. And it was a guy named Goliath, and David confronted him on that day. But his journey didn't start out to fight Goliath. His journey started out to be an errand boy for his father. So many of us would look at that and think that job's beneath us. I'm too large, I'm too big of a person for that task. I'm too big of a deal to do something so insignificant. And yet in the middle of serving somebody else's desires, somebody else's dream, that God was awaiting him to open up a door and elevate him in the eyes of a nation. It's weird how it's just unique how God does this. That in our ordinary, when it just feels so common that we get up again and we almost feel like our life has been relegated to this. And all we have is this. And it answers and speaks to who we are sometimes in our culture, that so many of us have somewhere-itis. I don't know where my happiness is, but it's not here. It's out there somewhere, and we continue to chase it. And we're never in a place where we feel content enough to serve, where we trust God to know that in this moment, I can't control anything else, but I control where I'm at right now. And in this moment, I can do what he's called me to do right now. No matter how insignificant it may seem in the eyes of another individual, it's what I have available and what I have in front of me. And if I'll be faithful, I know he's faithful. I know I can trust him. And so for all of us on an everyday basis, to get up and do the ordinary, to get up and do the mundane, to get up and do somebody else's bidding because it's what we have before us. Isn't that what parenting is? Parenting is investing in these little people that someday are going to leave us. And we get to watch them in this moment. We get to see their gifts before the world applauds them. And we just keep investing in their lives. And at the moment that they live with us, hardly ever are they in a place where they appreciate and know the sacrifices that we make. But in our faithfulness, we keep doing it because we realize there's something significant about investing in another human being. And so as we're faithful, we position ourselves to hear the voice of God. Jesus said, if you're faithful with somebody else's stuff, it's how you prove that you can be trusted with your own. Number 2 is this. When we are faithful with other people's things, we position ourselves to hear God's voice. If where you are, if it feels like all you're doing is just working in somebody else's, you just keep being faithful. You just keep being faithful. Your day will start out like an ordinary day, just like Moses's, just like David's. You'll be given an ordinary task. And on your way, the voice of God will begin to get your attention and say, I've been wanting to talk to you. I see you. And I want to talk to you about what I have for you. But it's while we're serving in the lives of somebody else. Number 2, when we are faithful with other people's things, we position ourselves to hear God's voice. Let's look at number 3 and we'll close with this. Go with me, if you would, to Genesis 40. Genesis 40, verse 1. Joseph was a guy in the Old Testament. He's another one of my favorite guys that, again, he wasn't a preacher. He was a guy he was a young man that was just, God had called him. And in Genesis 37, verse 5, it says this, that Joseph dreamed a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and they hated him all the more. So his brother, Joseph was the little brother, and I guess he was always kind of the guy, always kind of telling on his brothers, and they weren't crazy on him. How many of you have had a little brother or sister in here? How many of them, they ever tried to be your boss and tell you what to do, right? How many of you ever done that? And you always did what they said, right? No, if your parents weren't looking, you kind of thumped them in the head like, pink, and so I know David's in here, and he's our oldest, and him and his sister, Ashley, I could really tell some stories about those two, but just so that he's comfortable going to church here from now on, I'm going to leave it alone. Anyway, but there was just something, Joseph was that little brother. And so he had a dream, and he went and told his brothers, hey, man, I had this dream, and in it, you guys worked for me. And they're like, dude, you're high. We're not working for you. You need to get a blue chip, man. It's not happening. And so they already didn't like him because he would tell on them. He'd go to his dad and say, hey, you know what the brothers were doing the other day? They were being naughty and doing this. And so they'd get in trouble. They're like, we're not working for you. And so then he went and told his parents, hey, I had this dream. You guys were in it. Oh, really? What was it? You were working for me. Hey, that ain't happening. Get out of here before I bust your bottom. And so, here he has this, and maybe he thought like we do so many times whenever God gives us something and he speaks to us that it's going to happen immediately. And I've discovered in my own life that so many times, man, he'll place something in there and just this dissatisfaction, this grows to the point that if I'm not careful, it turns into discouragement. And then after discouragement builds up, eventually it turns into despair and then eventually into disappointment. Because I think because it didn't happen as soon as I thought it would, that it's never going to happen. And so Joseph tells his brothers hate him all the more and they think they're going to kill him. And one of them says, let's don't kill him, let's sell him. Let's make some money off the dude. So they sell him, and he ends up being bought by a guy named Potiphar, who's high in Egypt's court. He was a man of position and power, and Joseph began to work for him. And even though Joseph could have gotten bitter with his family, could have felt like he was, mistreated, and wondered, how's this ever going to come to pass? Because my family was in this dream that God gave me, and they're not even a part of my life anymore. And as years go on, I don't even know if they're still alive. But he's good to Potiphar, and he takes care of him. And Potiphar begins to prosper and make money, and his household is blessed because Joseph is so faithful. Potiphar had one chink in his armor, and that is his wife was crazy. And so she would, thank you. So she would approach Joseph on a regular basis and try to seduce him, try to short circuit him from what God had for him. And every day he'd be like, no. And he told her, he said, look, your husband has trusted me with everything but you. How could I do this to him or to God by being unfaithful right now? And so this went on for a long period of time. And one day she was so desperate that she ripped off his coat. And he ran out of the house, and she saw herself in this predicament. So she screamed and falsely accused him of raping her. So he spends time in prison. Potiphar naturally believes his wife. He's highly positioned. He puts Joseph in this prison. For years, Joseph is in this prison. He's chained up. Even Psalms talks about him being chained in fetters. So he's chained up, and one day, doing his normal thing, just being a faithful prisoner. You say, what did Joseph do there? Well, he didn't get bitter. He wasn't angry. He wasn't mad at God. He was just faithful where he was. He just served where he was. He became the chief prisoner. What an honor. Put that on your resume. Best prisoner ever. Yeah. And so here he is. And so one day we'll pick up when this takes place in Genesis 40. Sometime later, Pharaoh's chief cupbearer and chief baker offended their royal master. Pharaoh became angry with these two officials, and he put them in the prison where Joseph was, in the palace of the captain of the guard. They remained in prison for quite some time, and the captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph. He looked after them. While they were in prison, Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker each had a dream one night, and each dream had its own meaning. When Joseph saw them the next morning, he noticed that they both looked upset. Why do you look so worried today? He asked them. And they replied, we both had dreams last night, but no one can tell us what they mean. Interpreting dreams is God's business, Joseph replied. Go ahead and tell me your dreams. I wonder if Joseph was tempted to look at them and go, don't go this way. Don't dream, it only leads to heartbreak. Or to go into the place and say, I wouldn't help you with yours. The people that I thought were going to help me with mine have put me here. He could have let anger and bitterness, and it would have sabotaged him. And yet Joseph, he didn't let those things change him or make him bitter in any way. He was still willing to invest in their dreams. And he said, you tell me your dream. And one of them shared his dream, and the interpretation of it was not good. He's like, it's not good for you. Things are getting ready to take a turn for the worse for you. And the other one said, this is my dream. And Joseph said, well, here's what's going to happen with you. You're going to be elevated out of here. And when you get elevated out of here by Pharaoh, you're going to stand before him in his presence and remind him of me. Tell him that I'm here. Tell him who I am. And you would think that that would be the place that this all ends, but the guy forgot about Joseph when it happened. I'm like, how do you forget about a guy that did this for you? And yet he did. And for like 2 more years, Joseph is still in prison. One day Pharaoh has a dream. And it says this, Pharaoh had this dream, and in this dream, none of his people could tell him what it meant. And this guy Joseph had interpreted his dream. He said, you know what? A couple of years ago when you were upset with me, I had a dream and I told it to this man and he told me what it meant, and here I am today. And I'm so sorry, but I think that guy may be able to help you. Well, where is he? He's still in prison. And so it says this, Pharaoh sent for Joseph at once, and he was quickly brought from the prison. After he shaved and changed his clothes, he went in and stood before Pharaoh. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream last night, and no one here can tell me what it means. But I have heard that when you hear about a dream, you can interpret it. It is beyond my power to do this, Joseph replied, but God can tell you what it means and set you at ease. So Pharaoh told Joseph his dream. In my dream, he said, I was standing on the bank of the Nile River. So Pharaoh begins to tell him his dream, and Joseph said, there were like these 7 really fat cows, and then there were 7 of these really lean cows. And he said, you're going to have 7 years of prosperity. And when that happens, you better save everything that you can, because the 7 lean are coming in. It's not just for here, but it's going to be for all over the world. And so that happened, and he was saying, well, I know. He said, that must be what my dream means. And so this is what happened as a result of that. It says, then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has revealed the meaning of the dreams to you, in other words, since you were willing to invest and be willing to help me in the dream that I've been given, clearly no one else as intelligent or wise as you are. You will be in charge of my court, and all my people will take orders from you. Only I, sitting on my throne, will have a rank higher than yours. It's interesting that as a young man, Joseph was given a dream in his heart. And we never have another instance or a moment where it talks about him having another dream. That every time that God was going to do something significant in his life, it was always when he was willing to invest in the dream of someone else. And his willingness to invest in Pharaoh's dream, instead of being bitter or angry at his family or angry at God or even angry at the guy that he was a part in elevating him out of there, that he continued, even for those guys that seemed like they couldn't be a part or a help to him, he would speak into their world and speak into their life. And his obedience and his humility and his tenderheartedness connected him to his destiny that God had for him. When you're faithful with other people's things, you can be trusted with your own. When you're faithful with the small things, you'll be faithful with the big things. Number 3 is this. God sometimes uses the dreams of others to fulfill our own. There's just opportunities to do things. And we do growth track here after the 1202 so that we want to stir people up so they can discover what their purpose is, what their gifts are, so they can connect in relationships. All these things are ingredients and elements of dreams, relationships, giftings, servings, growth, disappointment, learning. As a young man, he had a dream. He told it to his brothers. They hated him and sold him into slavery. He endured false accusation. He endured false imprisonment for years. And all of that was him proving himself and preparing himself for this great place. Great position is oftentimes accompanied by great pain in preparation. Letting go of things. Submitting ourselves to things, seeming to be anonymous and invisible, laying down those things as we prepare for this position that God has called us to. Man, Pastor Rick, all it seems like I'm doing is just serving in somebody else's thing. You're in the right place. All it doesn't seem like I ever get my own thing. You be faithful where you are. Wherever that is, whatever it is, use it as an act of worship. Be faithful to it. Give it up to God and continue to treat it as you would your own, because it's preparing you to have your own. And you position yourself to hear the voice of God for him to speak to you, and you position yourself to experience and eventually have the thing that God dealt with you about years ago. Number 3 is this: God sometimes uses the dreams of others to fulfill our own. Let's do this. Let's bow our heads and close our eyes for just a minute. Man, let's just spend a moment with God. Let him speak to us. Let him deal with us as he just be willing to just be humble, to let him do in our lives whatever it is that he wants to do so that we can respond however it is we need to respond. Let's just spend a moment with God.